Good afternoon and welcome to the session of our 2022 doctoral seminar series. My name is Vanessa Mpatlangane. I'm a doctoral research fellow at HUMA, which is the Institute for Humanities in Africa at the University of Cape Town. It is an honor to be here and I welcome you again. Please note that the seminar is streaming on Facebook and we will be recording the session for our Facebook page. On the same Facebook page and our YouTube page, you will find previous recordings of seminars, both of doctoral seminars and other ongoing projects at HUMA, so please do check them out. Also note that you will not find our doctoral recordings weekly because we have our sessions only on the first and third Wednesday of the month. On that note, we do look forward to having you tonight, as well as seeing you at our next doctoral seminar, which is on the 2nd of November. So I hope you look forward to that, as I do. On the last note, before we get our show on the road, we are asking participants to please include their full names in the Zoom room, or else you might find yourself temporarily placed in the waiting room. Without further ado, we will get going. Tonight, we have with us Dr. Sanya Osha, who is currently at HUMA, and he is going to be giving us the presentation for tonight. Sanya Osha holds a PhD in philosophy and has taught the discipline at universities for more than a decade. He has published extensively on anthropology, cultural studies, knowledge systems of Africa, the politics of the West African region, and the social, political, and cultural realities of Southern Africa. He has undertaken extensive research on the discursive status of African systems of knowledge. He also spent a decade studying and teaching the sociological and political aspects of innovation studies. As an academic, he has held research positions at Smith College in the US, the University of Groningen, and the African Studies Center in the Netherlands and in South Africa, particularly at the University of KZN and the University of South Africa. At HUMA, we are very pleased to have him. He acts in his capacity and does work on various aspects of the On Being Human project and strengthens the publications arm and profile of the Institute. He's the author of several books, including, but not limited to, Post-Ethnophilosophy, which was published in 2011, and Ken Saro-Wiwa's Shadow. We are very pleased to have Sanya with us tonight. And without stalling any further, I'm going to ask him to go ahead. We will set aside 20 to 25 minutes for him to speak, and then we will open the floor for engagement after that. Sanya, thank you so much for joining us.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much, Vanessa. And thanks to Dominic and Angelique for extending this invitation to participate in this doctoral series. I'm really delighted and honored to be here, and I look forward to a very interesting session. The title of my presentation is called Kwasi Wiredu and the Question of Decolonization. Before I begin, I think I ought to preface my presentation with a brief background of Kwasi Wiredu's background, academic background, and who he was as a scholar. Kwasi Wiredu is originally from Ghana. He was born in 1931 in Ghana, and then he studied philosophy for his first degree at Legon. In University of Ghana, Legon, and then proceeded to Oxford University, where he acquired a master's degree in philosophy as well. The title of his thesis, under the supervision of Gilbert Ryle, who was a great prominent analytic philosopher. It's called Knowledge, Truth, and Reason. It was written submitted in just after 1952. He was admitted to Oxford in 1952, so a year later he submitted his thesis. After which he went back to Ghana to start to work at Legon. He worked in Legon. He taught there for almost 20 years. Then he left, he went to Nigeria, spent a couple of years in Nigeria, then went to the US. He went to the US in 1985. And he lived there, he worked there, and lived there at the University of Florida, where he recently passed on this year, which is, so this is one of the reasons I like to undertake this discussion of his work and contributions to African philosophy. He passed on in January 6th this year at the age of 90. So he had a very illustrious career, a very long life, and he was often called the greatest living African philosopher, even by his peers, like Pauline Otonji of the Benin Republic. They were the same generation. So that's Wiredu's background. Now, we also need to know the context in which he worked and how, and the sort of challenges, academic challenges he faced as a philosopher. One of the most debilitating challenges he had to face was the fact that the question of whether there was an African philosophy. Was there anything that could be called an African philosophy? When he was studying, he actually did not believe, because I mean there were no texts, there was no background to enlighten him about the possibilities of whether there was an African philosophy or not. He assumed, like most of his peers, and most would have assumed, that philosophy was Western, was Greek in its origins and orientation. And so, so he was trained in the Western analytic tradition, or more precisely, the British analytic tradition. And he did that for several years. But after a while, I think the challenges of decolonization, we must also take into cognizance the fact that several African countries, after from the late 50s, like Ghana gained independence in 1957, his country. And several African countries from then on started to gain independence from their erstwhile colonial masters. And so the challenge for African scholars, African philosophers in this case, was to contribute to the nation building project. And for Wiredu, part of the major existential and theoretical challenges that he also faced was, how do we confront this legacy of colonialism? How do we confront the challenge of decolonization? How do we confront the challenge of addressing the questions of modernity? And all these questions were tied together. And his project had to address all these questions and challenges. And in doing so, a lot of philosophers and scholars of African philosophy believed that he probably profiled one of the most stimulating, one of the most invigorating responses to this range of questions I've outlined. The question of the decolonizing African consciousness, the question of post-coloniality, and the question of devising theoretical and practical responses to the nation building project in Africa. And like I said, these weren't easy questions. They seem easy, but they were coming from like a background that says the African subject was saddled with pre-literate consciousness, because a lot of African communities were deemed to be illiterate, pre-literate consciousness, and also a pre-logical consciousness, which meant that the African consciousness in the Western imaginary wasn't endowed with faculties of reason or faculties of rationality as understood by philosophy and other canons of science. And so that was a challenge, and this was a challenge that was thrown to Africans by some of the most illustrious Western minds, philosophical minds, from Hegel to Kant to David Hume, the English empiricist. And so that was a big challenge for many philosophers of Wiredu's generation. How do we overcome these biases and these prejudices and this denigrations of the African mind by the Western intellectual culture generally? We've had like not only philosophers but also anthropologists who disagreed with the notion of the African mind having, or African consciousness having attained the highest level of evolution. That was something Wiredu and his generation of African scholars had to contend with. Now, the first thing, like I said, Wiredu did was to confront this biases, and he did that in three ways. One, the challenge to the notion that philosophy couldn't be done by Africans. Two, the challenge posed by the colonial legacy, which was to build new communities and to negotiate the fractures, the fissures, in the African consciousness within the context of modernity. And then finally, the confrontation with the challenge of building nations within a context of modernity itself. So those were the challenges he posed for himself theoretically. And in doing so, he said, the first thing he did, which was in the early 1970s or late 1960s, was that he believed in the notion or the idea of what he called the genetic methodology. The genetic methodology is ascribed to the American pragmatist philosopher John Dewey. In it, it tries to overcome or go beyond the limitations of analytic philosophy. And in so doing, it privileges or it affirms the centrality of the human subject, the human being, in existential questions, in confronting the challenges of existence and what have you. So in that way, Wiredu believe that by employing the concept of the genetic methodology, he could apply it to his own context. His own context being the Akan context in Ghana. Now, he also went beyond that also eventually, because I must mention that an incisive book, an incisive book was published on him only last year by the American philosopher called Barry Harlan, who lived for several years in Nigeria before he went back to the US, where he taught for several years also until he retired recently. Almost 80 years old too. And so he was in that Wiredu generation, and he knew the context in which Wiredu worked and what. And so, yeah, so he wrote a book called Reading Wiredu, published by Indiana University Press, in which he was making the argument that Wiredu should be seen perhaps primarily as an analytic philosopher. Now, I would go beyond that to say that he was not supposed to, he can't be looked just merely as an analytic philosopher, but an African philosopher in the sense that he confronted the challenges I posed. I said he addressed the challenges of modernity, the challenges of the colonial legacy, and the challenges of nation building within the context of building an African philosophical practice. So that, for me, is his most important contributions to the study of philosophy. And in doing so, like I mentioned earlier, without having explained, that he developed a concept called conceptual decolonization. And for me, that is one of the most radical, the most incisive concepts or theories also of decolonization. And I think many of the so-called forms of decolonial critique fall short in terms of their radical import when compared to Wiredu's concept of conceptual decolonization. And what does it mean by conceptual decolonization? Conceptual decolonization is a project or an exercise in comparative analysis, comparative linguistics, and a form of biculturalism, or also multiculturalism. How is this so? Wiredu's conceptual decolonization, theory of the conceptual decolonization, insists or argues that we should view concepts in Western philosophy, in the annals of Western philosophy, like truth, mind, religion, God, all the major concepts of Western philosophy, and we try and see if they make sense in our own indigenous languages. So that's why that's why it said that it was also an exercise in biculturalism, multiculturalism, and there's a certain bifocality of perception and conscious of concepts involved in this kind of project. Into looking at what exists, what certain Western philosophical concepts are saying and how they're used, and then we transfer them to our own indigenous African context to see if they make sense. If they make sense, then we adopt them and then we proceed. If they don't make sense, then we discard them. And so he was trying to build a new philosophical approach, approach by rebuilding both indigenous and modern African intellectual traditions from a philosophical standpoint. So he will look at certain concepts, and he did that. It wasn't just a question of him advocating for this approach in philosophy. It was also it also entailed him supplying several examples using his own Akan ethnic background. And because he was so successful doing this, a lot of other philosophers, especially amongst the Anglophone sector of African philosophy adopted it as well. In the various contexts, rather than having it done in Akan, you have it done in, for instance, Fon. You have it done also in Yoruba. You have it done in various African languages, in which what is being done is to re-examine Western philosophical concepts within an indigenous African context to see if they are viable, if they are meaningful, if they are useful. And so it's a project of not only of modernist reconstruction, but also philosophical evolution and development. It's a totally different approach. And the sad part of it is that in this age of decoloniality and the forms of decolonial critique, the consequences and the implications of this approach haven't been extensively studied, haven't been studied, at least to my knowledge, with great care and great incisiveness to see what are the implications thereof, in adopting this approach. So that is some of the important contributions of Kwasi Wiredu to philosophy. I might also extend that to how he stands in relation to his peers in Africa who are also dealing with the same problematics, the same kinds of challenges philosophically and intellectually that he was facing, that he faced in his day and age. And in I think also because of the ways in which his thought developed, the ways in which his thought evolved and shifted in conjunction with the challenges that he was trying to surmount, is quite interesting, because what we see is that a set different layers, we see different layers and different levels of complexity in which we can address and speak of this thought. For instance, he was called, he was said to belong to the Universalist School of Philosophy. And by belonging to the Universalist School of Philosophy, it meant that he and his colleagues, such as Pauline Otunji of Benin Republic, the late and equally great Henry Odera Oruka of Kenya, who's regarded as one of the founders of what is called the Sage Philosophy School of African Philosophy, and Peter Bodori, another African philosopher schooled in the analytic tradition of Nigeria. So they were about those were the 4 key members of that school, the Universalist School of African Philosophy, who were tackling the same kinds of issues, and they were meeting regularly in conferences, in symposia, on various kinds of formal and informal gatherings in which they were debating these issues, writing, responding to each other, and working in conjunction with one another. So that was one school. Then you also had the Philosopher King's School of African Philosophy, and this school comprised of politicians, academics such as Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana, who was also the first president of the independent Republic of Ghana, Kwame Nkrumah. You had Leopold Sedar Senghor of Senegal, who was from Senegal, and then you had Julius Nyerere of Tanzania. They weren't all philosophers in their, but they were dealing with certain important philosophical issues that eventually African philosophers came to adopt as being central to their discipline. And they led the way also in trying to surmount the challenges of colonialism, modernity, and nation building in Africa. So these three philosophers that I mentioned were called the philosopher kings of Africa, and they belong to that school of philosophy. Then you have the sage philosophy school of African philosophy, which I said was popularized by the late Kenyan philosopher called Henry Odera Oruka, who passed on in 1996. Now, this school of philosophy tried to gather the thoughts of, first of all, a trained philosopher, trained in this sense in the Western understanding of philosophy, would go into an ethnic group, an ethnic community, identify certain sages, certain wise men, old wise men, who ostensibly or invariably do not write and read this Western text. They're not schooled in Western education. And then they will gather the thought, the philosophers will gather their thoughts, and then they transcribe and try to present it in a scholarly manner, or at least in a manner that would be legible to an illiterate audience. And so that they transcribed it, which is also similar in a way to a discredited school of philosophy called the School of Ethnophilosophy, discredited by the Beninois philosopher called Pauline Otunji, who was very scathing in his attack, because this school of philosophers were actually primarily pursued by Western anthropologists, usually anthropologists of with sometimes with a clerical background. Also clergymen. I have in mind someone like Placid Temples who worked in Rwanda primarily, and he was Belgian. So that school of philosophy was discredited very severely by Pauline Otunji, but I think in some ways it has some similarities with the sage philosophy, school of sage philosophy, which became quite established within the East African region. So these were the main philosophical schools that were established and that were in contention, sometimes collaborating during the time Wiredu was pursuing his thought. And out of these schools of philosophy, those that have Wiredu's idea or practice of philosophy is one of the most established amongst all of them. We can see this by the sheer number of doctoral theses, master's dissertations, engagements. There's been such like an industry of discourse built around his work. That is how he influential. And the funny thing is that he was such a modest man. He wasn't that gregarious. He didn't visit, he didn't go. He went to, during his day, he was meeting with his peers and discussing philosophy issues in Africa, what have you. But as time went on, I think he just focused more on his research, and the impact of his work has been so profound and it's even getting more to be more so beyond the scope of Africa, because I think a lot of people are seeing that he was the rigor, the neatness of his thought, and the precision with which he applied himself to the questions that he chose to address, the questions of decolonization, the questions of building a modern African philosophical practice, the questions of arriving at a cultural synthesis between Euro-modernity and African indigenous systems. So these were the issues he addressed, and he did that in such an eloquent and incisive way that his influence has continued to be felt beyond the parameters of African philosophy itself. I would stop here for now and then hope to engage with the audience with comments, and then elaboration, also discussions. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you, Vanessa, for having me. I look forward to the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sanya. We appreciate the conversation starter and the presentation. I'm going to then open the floor for some hands. Those that are unable to unmute and speak, please do feel free to put your comment, your question on the chat. Do we have any comments or questions from the floor? Maybe I am gonna abuse my seat and go first. If you could say a little bit more about Wiredu's work around where you started us off around conceptual decolonization. I'm asking, if you can say a little bit more. I know you did say you had started off, but I'd like to hear a little bit more about that, specifically the aspect of finding a way to merge what you refer to as indigenous and modern philosophy and using that as an approach. How did he go about that, and what is that, in what way is that profitable even to us right now in the context and the times that we're in?
Okay. Thank you so much, Vanessa. Thank you. Okay, conceptual decolonization. What he meant by conceptual decolonization was that he looked at certain concepts, Western philosophical concepts like truth. Truth is a major Western philosophical concept. What is truth? What is knowledge? What is fact? What is fact? What is a fact? What is morality? How do we define morality? And some of the things, he would take these concepts, right? This Western philosophy that are deemed to be prominent within the annals of Western philosophy, and then he go back to he comes from the Akan ethnic group in Ghana. So he go back to his ethnic group, look at it linguistically. What does truth mean in my language, in my indigenous culture? What does it mean? How do we define it? How do we use it? And the interesting thing was that in many of some of these instances, they didn't. So these words or terms or concepts in Western philosophy or metropolitan languages, didn't always translate neatly into the Akan concept, like a personhood, person. If, for instance, you take person, what is a person? And we look at it in the Southern African context. A person is a person through other human beings. A person is a person because of that's what Ubuntu means, right? It's person in community. A person, you're always in relation. It's not the individualistic Western understanding of what a person is. So, and in a lot of African contexts, you do have that sort of thing. you do have that sort of understanding of what a person is. It's slightly different. You know, even in terms of trying to translate it, it's quite difficult because a lot of it gets missing in translation. That gets lost in translation because it doesn't really translate well. You know, in this sort of yeah, you're a person because of another person, you know, that it's very difficult to define or to explain in a metropolitan language based on capitalist values and individualist values as well. So those are the sort of questions he was trying to address, and how, and you know, and yeah, so his findings were also quite, like I said, quite remarkable because they were quite unexpected. I'll give you another example. This is not to say that all his findings were palatable or put African indigenous systems and cultures in a good light. Sometimes he was saying that we have to also critically engage with our indigenous cultures to see when they are actually promoting our interests, when they are actually, affirming us in a way that they should within a modern context. And if they weren't doing so, we should not be reluctant to discard them. We should be very quick to discard them in order to move ahead, in order to forge ahead. For instance, a question of morality, or things like, or polygamy. In the Western polygamy in the traditional context. Polygamy in the traditional context made sense because in pre-colonial times, before the intrusion of advanced capitalism, it made sense because people were African communities were largely agrarian. So you needed to have large families who would help you in going to the farms and going, and harvesting all the planting. These were labor-intensive exercises, endeavors, and you needed people who you didn't have money to pay for. So you had to produce people, you had to have large families in order to do that, because a lot of people also relied on subsistence farming, just for what you needed for your family, and that was all. But with the advent of colonialism and capitalism, it didn't make sense. So for those saying, want to have several wives within a modern country, just doesn't make sense. It doesn't make economic sense. And Wiredu argued this. He pointed this out, that it doesn't make sense. And he also compared, for instance, the idea of democracy, how it worked within the traditional African context. He said, what he argued that major Western democracies were largely majoritarian. It was about majority rule, but how Africans practiced democracy, what another philosopher, the late Congolese philosopher, Ernest Wamba Dewamba, the institution of the palaver, in which we have the village squares, in which you go to the village, everyone you have age grades, you had groups, and then you had interests, everyone presented their views, and then you gradually come to a consensus. So that was a practice of consensual democracy in motion within an indigenous African context, which also came to arrive at conclusions, at decisions through a form of deliberation, public deliberation that entailed everyone, and it was about arriving at a consensus and not about majority. They say, oh, this is the majority says that we have to arrive at a consensus, and that, yes. So he said, traditional African societies practice consensual democracies, a consensual form of democracy. So a lot of his work was actually about this various exercises in comparative analysis from a cultural point of view, from a linguistic point of view, from a philosophical point of view, and also from a political point of view. So it's a huge, wide-ranging project, like I said, and it's had a huge impact on the practice of modern African philosophy. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sanya. That's actually quite insightful, and thanks for sharing those quite tangible examples. I do believe there is one other person with a question, Wangui. I don't see her in the room as yet, so we will make room for others to comment as well. Do we have other comments, perhaps?
Vanessa, I see Lerato that has a raised hand.
Yes, there's Lerato. Thank you so much, Dom. Yes, Lerato.
Thank you so much, Sanya, for your wonderful presentation. Can everyone hear me?
Yes, we can.
I was pleased to hear that the comment you made about you don't think that there's been enough attention paid specifically to Wiredu's notion of conceptual decolonization, because I've been thinking about it a bit more recently. So it's good that I'm not crazy thinking that it hasn't been taken up as much as I think it should, especially given the current context or trendiness of decolonization. So I have two questions that maybe also implicitly have like remarks in them, but I'll frame them as questions. So I wanted to ask what your thoughts are, or if you could say something about, in the context of his conception of his notion of conceptual decolonization, and also his work, how he distinguished between concept and categories and conception. So it seems to me, in general, there's usually and I don't know if there is a distinction between concept and conception, but it seems to me that maybe there's some thinking we need to do about whether and when we are reconstructing or revising or reworking out a concept or a conception or a category. So for example, in one of his works, I think he points out the fact that he doesn't think that the category of religion, and he says category instead of concept, of religion is rightly applied when talking about the set of beliefs with regards to the spiritual within African belief system. The distinction between concept, conception, and category in the context of and then I wanted to ask the second question is, say something about how or where Wiredu's notion and project of conceptual decolonization fits within the current sort of, maybe let me call it the Latin American conception or approach of decoloniality. Like, what do you see as the relation, if any? And I will leave my questions there for now, and yeah, maybe I'll ask some more later. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lerato, for, I suppose you're a philosopher, right? Because I mean, this are quite rigorous questions, quite precise and thought-provoking. Thank you so much for that.
I am by training, but I don't like to tell people I'm a philosopher.
That's it. She shows. Wow. Very good questions. I hope I can do justice to them. The first one, concept and conceptualization. Well, Wiredu, we must also remember, was an analytic philosopher and a very, very good one, a very competent one, very skilled. But I'm not sure, because I didn't come across any of his works in which he dealt with these questions quite specifically. But I mean, what you're mentioning, he did, and I think he could have, perhaps he could. I think he would have, if he wanted to, he could have, because he, like I said, is quite skilled. He knows the English language quite well, but then also he also is quite knowledgeable about Akan traditional concepts and words, and but to my knowledge, I haven't come across him dealing specifically with the questions you asked. Like I said, but I'm not. But my feeling and my thinking, because of, like I said, because of his considerable skill as an analytic philosopher, if he had chosen to deal with them, he would have done that quite competently. But because I think the focus of his research was also quite specific, because he was trying to build a modern philosophical practice that blended or brought together his Western training on the one hand and his Akan background on the other. Because I mean, what he found, and to the perhaps dismay of certain Western philosophers or Western scholars, was that there's a lot within African cultures that are full of philosophical merit, even though we didn't express them in a way that is, within the Western canon of rationality. We must also know that there are several canons of rationality. Our canons of rationality speak to us because we also know that knowledge is a kind of they have to compete or contest within contested terrains into which they marginal knowledges are suppressed, and they become marginal through technologies of domination by hegemonic systems or hegemonic powers and cultures. And the tendencies for these hegemonic cultures is to suppress that knowledges or systems they don't understand, and they don't for whatever reasons they choose, and perhaps also for colonial triumphalism, they've been able to suppress people and whatever. So might is right in this case, Yeah. So but coming back to your question, I'll look for how he treats them, if he addresses the concept of the relationship or difference between concept and conceptualization. But I haven't come across how he dealt with it. Now, the very important question that you raised about Wiredu's work and Wiredu's notion of conceptual decolonization and decoloniality as practiced by the Latin Americans. This is a very interesting question, which I posed to our last speaker at a seminar series last month. There was a professor from Rhodes University called Professor Uchenna Okeja. He presented a paper, incidentally, on Kwasi Wiredu, critiquing Kwasi Wiredu. Again, you see how important he is, how we have to come back to him. We always have to come back to him. And so he critiqued Wiredu severely. And and I raised the question of this question you asked, and how come, what is the relation, or how come, for instance, the Latin Americans haven't engaged Wiredu the way they ought to. On my own, I've been doing research on this question. And what I found out that when when Walter Mignolo came here, these centuries ago, and he was talking about decoloniality, went to UNISA, was talking about, and people are saying, wow, this is wonderful, this is impressive, blah, 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 blah. And he says, well, what is so impressive? We got all of this from you. We got all of this from you. It's from you. So are you, and he was honest enough to admit that. But because of the global academic industry has adopted this decoloniality, decolonial critique, we've forgotten the roots. And we also just need to go back to someone like Ngugi wa Thiong'o. Ngugi wa Thiong'o, to even before, he's as important as Wiredu in this regard, because what he did he do? He was after writing in English for a long time, he says, no, I mean, this is African literature in English. Let me write for my people, the Gikuyus, and use my language and see what the sort of impact that would have. And he started to write in Gikuyu. So it was this is a form of linguistic decolonization. And we have also someone like Sheikh Anta Diop, who carried out a project I would call a decolonization of African historiography. It was a decolonial critique before decoloniality became what it is today of African historiography, and because he totally transformed how we view ancient African history and histories from the ancient time to almost now. It's a totally different perspective of the African cultural systems, African intellectual systems that we get from reading Sheikh Anta Diop, which we never presented within Western scholarship until perhaps recently, when all their old views have been transformed, old racist views have been transformed. So that the roots of decolonial critique, the roots of decolonial decoloniality, you shouldn't be surprised to know in Africa, where we have scholars who've done far more radical critique, because we have also it's not working within Spanish, or for instance Portuguese. We are working with multiple languages, in any African context, multiple languages. It's a form of exercises in comparative analysis, culturally, philosophically, and linguistically, at several layers. And like I said, the roots are here, and the implications of that kind of project can only be understood within African context because of the complexities, multiple layers of complexity you find in such exercises here. They're not linear at all. They're quite complex, quite layered. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sanya, and thanks for that wonderful question, Lerato. I do believe Wangui is here. Wangui, please do go ahead and ask your question, and then we will go on to Sarah's question and call it a day.
Thank you, Vanessa, and sorry to everyone. I was navigating load shedding just as I was trying to move from my phone to laptop, so I came back to the phone, so apologies. First, honestly, thank you so much, Sanya. I really was quite moved by your talk, which, you narrate in such a normal and humble way, but I really felt really quite inspired, and it was really, thank you, really brilliant. And so I have some questions which obviously are going to convey my complete ignorance about African philosophy, which I hope to remedy with your help one day when I ambush you. But I just maybe I'll try and make them more concise because of time. So the one I wanted to ask you is, it seems from my very great ignorance that we as philosophers or philosophy Africans are still dealing with the same questions that Wiredu was dealing with about nation building, about can Africans think, do they have a philosophy? And I see that in some ways mirrored in urban studies, which is sometimes is my field, where there's always questions about whether Africans are contributing something to theoretical to the discipline. And I feel we're still grappling with that. So my question is, do you think we're still dealing with these same questions and nation building, us as subjects? Do we make theory? And what does that mean? I hope that's kind of clear. And I think I'll stop with that now, and then I can also try and ambush you for some of my other questions, but thank you.
Thank you so much, Wangui. I was expecting you because I was going to, I was going to talk on Ungugi, and I know you'd have a lot to share with us on that. And so I was expecting you to be here, and thank you for your questions. They're very important questions, and also quite pertinent to what we've been discussing. Thank you for them. The question of African philosophy, I think your apprehensions are quite spot on, actually. They're quite spot on about the ambivalence of Africans doing theory, the ambivalence about the nation building project in Africa, and the ambivalence of Africans moving beyond the question of whether African philosophy exists or whether it exists or it doesn't. Yes, I can't agree with you more. I feel the same ambivalence. I'm not quite. A lot of times I'm not. Because like what I mentioned when I was trying to respond to Lerato, how certain knowledge forms are suppressed, and they're done deliberately, because what gets promoted and circulated it's also a very political issue. There's a lot of work being done all over Africa. In your country, for instance, Kenya, there's been a lot of very important work by great philosophers there. But the question is that how much of this is projected? Until recently, and it's like it's only entertained, accepted, discussed by specialists in specific fields. If it's in African philosophy, and so it doesn't get circulated widely, because there's also a hierarchy that exists in which how ideas get circulated and disseminated and what have you. But when we look deep down, when we look at what exists, there's a lot going on. I'll speak about one great theorist, that great Indian theorist, one of the four pioneers of post-colonial theories, Gayatri Spiva, and her humility and her in wanting to engage with African scholars is just awe-inspiring, because this is a person who's written some of the densest texts. She translated Jacques Derrida. She translated of grammatology when it was first published as a young scholar in the 70s. But when she engages, the late Hari Garuba at UCT was a close friend and collaborator, and how she engages with Africans. She talks eloquently about what, for instance, Ngugi accomplished, how she is very important to our work as a post-colonial scholar. So that is one exception. So I think it's the hierarchy. There's a hierarchy in which African ideas get accepted or discarded, and then how they get disseminated. It's this. But the fortunate thing is that there's a lot of important scholarship being produced by Africans, not only on the continent but in the diaspora. But I think that, like I said, the hierarchization of knowledge forms and the politics of dissemination and how they're accepted and circulated within academia. There's the gatekeeping mechanisms at work, that also technologies of even technologies of domination within knowledge producing systems that make sure certain ideas get minimal recognition or discussion, and those that do get circulated and promoted. And so it's not, we try to say we're objective as scholars and how we do, but there's a lot of politics and also skullduggery behind the circulation and promotion of ideas within academia, in the public realm. Right? So I think we have to take that into cognizance. And this was acknowledged even by certain Latin America. Like I said, when Walter Mignolo came here, and the people were in awe about what he was doing, about the decolonial theory and what have you. And I said, look, what are you guys talking about? All these ideas were gotten here, I developed. This is where I received them from. So that's what I have to say. But I look forward to engaging with you more. Wangui, thank you so much for the questions. They're quite thought-provoking. I mean, I think we need to continue this conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much to you both. And our last question is coming from Sarah in the chat, and they are asking, how can we as young African scholars begin to develop the skills needed to critique and decolonize what we read and are expected to interpret as knowledge? How best can we also begin to articulate our own intellectual positions in the academia?
Thank you so much. Thank you. Very, very good question as well. Very good question. One of the ways in which, first of all, you have to unlearn what you were taught. That's the first. That's the first step towards intellectual self-realization. You have to unlearn what you taught, because I mean, even as scholars, when you are syllabi are usually quite restricted. They don't tell. They give you like a map, a road map, but they're not. They don't contain. They don't give you everything. So you have to discover what works for you. And then more importantly, that's why I said you have to learn what you have been taught. Is to find out what was left out in your education. What was left, because you wouldn't be given everything. Like I said, you will only be given the barest minimum usually, because I mean, you're studying within a specific time frame, and and not everything can be covered in the teaching and learning process. So you have to go beyond, and that's why once you equip yourself, when you're confident enough to know that, okay, now I can go out and find things out for myself, then you find out that there's a lot you need to know, and there's a lot that can be learned and shared. And that's the way in which you arrive at your own specific intellectual identity, and the ways in which you think you can contribute meaningfully to your context, your environment, your society, what have you. Yeah, so that's it. So first of all, like I said, to unlearn what you've been taught, and then go beyond it, relearn it, and then go beyond it. Thank you so much.
Thank you so very much, Sanya. Thank you for your talk. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, everyone who has joined us today. We really appreciate you coming through. Please do check out our website, the Humor website, to keep up to date with all our ongoing projects and to keep up with our fellows and scholars as well. We look forward to seeing you on November 2nd at our next doctoral seminar. Good night.
Thank you.